It was the spring of 2020, and the world was in the grip of an unprecedented pandemic. My family and I had been confined to our apartment for weeks, and the monotony of our lockdown life was beginning to take its toll. Little did we know that the horrors of isolation were about to take on a whole new meaning. Our apartment, 13B, was located on the 13th floor of a high-rise building. It had always been a quiet and unassuming place, but as the days turned into weeks and then months, strange things began to happen. It all started innocently enough. One evening, I was sitting in the living room watching a movie to distract myself from the gloom of the outside world. My parents were in their room, and my little sister was engrossed in a video game. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway. At first, I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, but it grew louder and more persistent. I muted the TV and strained my ears to listen. The tapping seemed to be coming from the front door. It was as if someone was gently rapping their knuckles against the wood. My heart pounded in my chest as I cautiously approached the door. I hesitated for a moment before I mustered the courage to open it. To my relief, there was no one there. I looked up and down the dimly lit hallway but saw no signs of anyone. My parents and sister were still preoccupied with their own activities, so I decided not to mention it to them, thinking it might have been a neighbor playing a prank. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tapping had left me with an eerie sense of unease. As I drifted into fitful sleep, I was plagued by strange dreams of shadowy figures standing outside our apartment door. The following evening, as I was helping my mom prepare dinner, the lights in the kitchen began to flicker. I thought it was just a power fluctuation, but then the cabinets started creaking open on their own. My mom and I exchanged bewildered glances, and she nervously muttered, "It must be an electrical issue." I tried to rationalize it, blaming it on the stress of the ongoing lockdown. But deep down, I knew it was something more. That night, after we had finished dinner and retired to our rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every little sound, every shadow, felt like it was closing in on us. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences escalated. Whispering voices echoed through the apartment when no one was speaking. Objects moved on their own, and the taps on the door became more insistent, almost like a desperate plea for attention. One evening, as I sat in my room trying to focus on my online classes, I heard a loud crash coming from the living room. I rushed out to find that the coffee table had been overturned, and our family portrait lay shattered on the floor. My parents and sister were equally terrified, and we knew we could no longer ignore the sinister presence that had invaded our home. Desperate for answers, my father searched online for any information about the history of our apartment building. He discovered that many years ago a family had lived in 13B, but tragedy had struck. A young boy had died under mysterious circumstances, and the family had moved out, leaving the apartment vacant. We decided to seek help from a local paranormal investigator, hoping to put an end to the torment we were enduring. The investigator arrived one evening, armed with various gadgets and a grim expression. As he began his investigation, strange readings and eerie voices filled the apartment. It was clear that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. The investigator conducted a séance in the living room, attempting to communicate with the restless spirit that seemed to haunt our home. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension as the room plunged into darkness. Then, a voice whispered through the darkness, "Help me." It was the voice of a child, filled with sorrow and longing. The investigator tried to communicate further, asking for the spirit's name and what it wanted. The response was chilling: freedom. We learned that the spirit of the young boy, who had died so tragically in our apartment, was trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. His presence had grown restless and vengeful during the lockdown, and he sought release from his earthly tether. Over the course of several weeks, with the help of the investigator, we performed a series of rituals to help the spirit find peace. It was an unsettling and exhausting process, filled with strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. But little by little, the spirit's presence began to fade, and the apartment returned to its normal, quiet self. As the world slowly emerged from the grip of the pandemic, our lives returned to a semblance of normalcy. The horrors of lockdown had taken on a whole new meaning for us, as we had come face to face with a supernatural presence that had tested our sanity and our bonds as a family. I will never forget the lockdown horror story of Apartment 13B, where the isolation of the pandemic had opened a door to the unknown, and where a restless spirit had sought release from the confines of our world. It was a chilling experience that left us forever changed, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the supernatural can intrude upon our lives in the most unexpected ways. I'll never forget the day it all began, the day our quiet suburban neighborhood turned into a nightmare. It was a sunny afternoon and the world seemed normal. But little did I know that the true horror was lurking just around the corner, hidden in the shadow of a seemingly ordinary lockdown. The pandemic had forced us all into isolation, and the initial novelty of staying home had worn thin. Like everyone else, I was adjusting to the new normal of working and studying from home. My family and I were trying to make the best of the situation, binge-watching shows and playing board games to pass the time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a peculiar sound from outside. It was a low, guttural growl, almost animalistic in nature. I dismissed it as a stray dog or maybe a raccoon. But then, the sound grew louder, and it was clear that this was no ordinary animal. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped out the back door, leaving my worried family behind. As I ventured into our backyard, the growling grew more intense, and the night felt oddly heavy. The darkness seemed to close in around me. I aimed my flashlight toward the source of the sound and froze in terror. There, in the middle of our yard, stood a figure that defied all logic. It was tall and emaciated, with long, bony limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was ashen and stretched tightly over its skeletal frame. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed with an otherworldly crimson light. This creature, if it could even be called that, was unlike anything I had ever seen. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away slowly. The creature took a step closer, and I could see its mouth contorting into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Without thinking, I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I tried to explain what I had seen to my family, but they dismissed it as a product of my overactive imagination, a result of the stress and isolation we were all experiencing. I couldn't blame them. What I had witnessed was beyond the realm of reason. Over the next few nights, the growling persisted, and each time, I would cautiously peer outside, only to catch fleeting glimpses of that abhorrent creature lurking in the darkness. It seemed to be watching our house, waiting for something. I couldn't sleep, and my anxiety grew with each passing day. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, I heard the growling once again, but this time it was accompanied by a series of scratching sounds, like claws against wood. The noises were coming from the room adjacent to mine, which was my younger brother's bedroom. I burst into his room, and the sight that greeted me was enough to make my blood run cold. The creature, that nightmarish being, had somehow made its way into the house and was crouched over my brother's bed. My brother lay motionless, his face drained of color and his eyes wide with terror. Without hesitation, I grabbed a heavy book from the nearby shelf and hurled it at the creature. It let out a guttural shriek and darted out of the room, disappearing into the darkness. My brother was shaken but unharmed, and I locked the door and placed a chair against it for good measure. The next day, I contacted the police, desperate for help. I told them about the creature, and they sent an officer to investigate. The officer was skeptical but agreed to patrol our neighborhood. However, each night the creature grew bolder, coming closer to the house. We began to hear its voice, a chilling whisper that seemed to seep through the walls. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, filled with malevolence and dark promises. My family and I were trapped in our own home, terrorized by this unexplainable horror. Days turned into weeks, and the lockdown continued. But it was no longer the pandemic that we feared. It was the presence of that abominable creature, a living nightmare that defied all reason. We couldn't escape it, and we couldn't make anyone believe us. As the creature's influence grew, it started to affect our minds. We began to doubt each other, paranoia taking hold. My family's once warm and loving bonds deteriorated into suspicion and fear. It was as if the creature fed on our collective dread. One fateful night, unable to bear the torment any longer, I ventured out alone, determined to confront the creature and put an end to this nightmare. Armed with a baseball bat, I roamed the dark streets, following the eerie whispers that guided me. I eventually found myself in an abandoned building, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. In a room at the heart of the structure, I found the creature waiting for me, its crimson eyes burning with malevolence. It spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice that echoed with the suffering of countless souls. In that moment, I realized the true horror of the lockdown. It wasn't just the isolation and uncertainty, it was the darkness that had seeped into our world. A darkness that had given birth to this unspeakable evil. I swung my bat with all my strength, but it was as if I was striking at a shadow. The creature enveloped me, and I felt myself being pulled into a vortex of despair and madness. My mind shattered as I descended into a nightmarish abyss, consumed by the very horror that had plagued our lives. To this day, my family and I remain in lockdown, not due to any pandemic, but because we are prisoners of the darkness that was unleashed during those long, harrowing nights. The creature still lurks, its growls and whispers a constant reminder of the horror we cannot escape. If you ever hear a growling in the night, if you ever see a crimson-eyed figure in the darkness, pray that it passes you by. Pray that you never become part of the lockdown horror story that has consumed our lives. For once you enter that abyss, there is no escape, and the true terror of isolation will become all too real. The piercing sound of the alarm echoed through the empty corridors of my office building, a stark contrast to the usual hum of activity. It was late, well past the time when most employees had left for the day. I was one of the few still working, caught up in a project that demanded my attention. The sudden lockdown announcement caught me off guard. I quickly saved my work and shut down my computer, my heart pounding in my chest. Lockdowns were rare, but they always brought a sense of unease. The building was old, with a history that whispered through its dimly lit hallways and creaking floorboards. I stepped out of my office and into the deserted corridor, the silence broken only by the distant wail of the alarm. An eerie feeling settled over me, a sense of isolation that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of the night, but this felt different, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I made my way towards the nearest stairwell, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. As I reached the stairwell, a sudden chill ran down my spine. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing there. The corridor was empty, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the alarm. I shook off the feeling and started down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell's confined space. The air grew colder as I descended, and a strange smell filled my nostrils, a mix of dampness and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I reached the basement level, the lowest point of the building. The air was even colder here, and the smell was stronger, almost overpowering. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, a sense of dread washing over me. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit basement. The smell hit me full force, a mixture of dampness, decay, and something else, something metallic. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to move forward, my curiosity overpowering my fear. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and narrow corridors, the walls lined with old filing cabinets and forgotten boxes. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a few flickering fluorescent bulbs. I wandered through the labyrinthine basement, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The smell grew stronger as I ventured deeper, and the feeling of dread intensified. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I turned a corner and found myself in a long, narrow corridor. At the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, a faint light emanating from within. I felt a strange pull towards the door, an irresistible urge to see what lay beyond. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the crack, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small and empty, except for a single chair in the center. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the smell of decay now overwhelming. The room was cold and damp, and the air felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. I approached the chair, my eyes drawn to the dark stains that covered it. The smell of blood was unmistakable. I reached out to touch the chair, but a sudden noise made me jump back. A scratching sound coming from behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart in my throat. There was nothing there, just the empty room and the flickering light. I took a deep breath and turned back to the chair. The scratching sound started again, louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned around again, my eyes scanning the room. There was still nothing there, but the scratching sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and I backed away from the chair, my eyes darting around the room. The scratching sound was now deafening, and I could feel a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled around blindly, my hands outstretched, searching for the door. The scratching sound was all around me now, and I could feel the presence closing in on me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. I was in my office, the lights still on, the computer still humming. The lockdown alarm was silent, the building still and quiet. I looked around, disoriented and confused. Had it all been a dream? The basement, the chair, the scratching sound, the cold hand on my shoulder? I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm glow over the buildings and streets. The world seemed so normal, so peaceful, so far removed from the nightmare I had just experienced. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk, sitting down heavily in my chair. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just a dream, a product of my overworked mind and the eerie atmosphere of the lockdown? Or was it something more, something real, something that had happened in that basement, in that room, with the chair? I opened my eyes and looked at the chair, the same chair I had seen in my dream. It was empty, of course, but the dark stains were still there, a stark reminder of what I had seen. I stood up and walked over to the chair, reaching out to touch the stains. They were dry and crusty, but the smell of blood was still there, faint but unmistakable. I recoiled from the chair, a wave of nausea washing over me. It was real. It had to be real. The dream, the basement, the chair, the blood. I turned and ran out of my office, down the corridor, and out of the building. I didn't stop running until I was far away, until the building was just a distant speck on the horizon. I never went back to that building, never saw that chair again. But the dream, the memory of that night, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the world we think we know.